I have to tell you now, this country is at war with Germany.
DICE's latest Battlefield released a year ago, and since I took advantage of the free weekend and made 11 whole Let's Plays, I feel I've played just enough to inject my own take on it. I've also taken the liberty of watching the endings of the war stories on YouTube that I didn't finish on my own. Now, while I did play a little bit of multiplayer, it just wasn't my cup of tea. Hey, who asked you? Yeah, get out of here. Anyway, because of this, I'll be focusing primarily on the single-player war stories. I'm more of a single-player story kind of guy anyway, unless of course it's Team Fortress 2.
The fathers of our own future. That future must be chosen, nurtured, guided.
I'll be honest, I've been more of a retro shooter kind of guy. I don't often play new war shooters like Battlefield or Call of Duty. Still, for the most part, once you've played one, you've played them all. You've got the usual suspects like limited sprint, a 2-weapon limit, regenerating health, that whole spiel. I'll give Battlefield 5 some credit at least. Having a visible health meter with a numeric value is better than the older method of just caking blood on the screen, but this seems to be a pretty standard issue for DICE these days. I will say though, tanks are surprisingly satisfying to use. I mostly used one in The Last Tiger, but it was pretty fun blowing crap up, and the repair system had a good enough risk versus reward system since you're a sitting duck while you're fixing it up. Basically, that just means you either have to wait between combat rounds or just find a solid building to hide behind. It's a nice twist on the regeneration health system where you at least have to do the work to regenerate your damage. Airplanes were also just fine for what they were, even though I wasn't all that good with it due to the way it handles. I've played at least one airplane simulator before, and this might just be one of those instances where a controller would feel better to play, but mouse and keyboard wasn't that great in my opinion. The game also seems to encourage you to play on stealth for much of the campaign mode, unless of course you're just a really good shooter and can quickly pick off enemies while they're all shooting at you. Thankfully, stealth is pretty feasible once you get used to it, with an eye filling to let you know when they're about to go hostile, and you can throw a lure to get their attention with some sound. Nordley's actually had the most going for it in that regard, since you throw throwing knives to take individual guards out stealthfully. I actually kind of wish the other two primarily on foot war stories had access to that if I'm honest. It would be nice to not have to melee guards from behind to avoid alerting everyone in the surrounding area. Also have noticed that Nordley's uniquely gives you skis. This is obviously more understandable because you kind of need snow to ski on, but it was actually pretty fun from the little bit I tried of it. Also worth noting is that in one part of the campaign you need to go from fire to keep from freezing to death, and this wasn't quite so fun. Perhaps one of the more satisfying moments, however, is if you manage to find an anti-air gun to hop into. Although it was made specifically to take down planes, it fires explosives so you can mow down guards really easily with it if you've got them in your crosshairs. There are also regular turrets to fire from, with both of them having a cooldown, so you can't completely just hold down the fire button. Grenades, of course, are standard fare for these games by now. Dynamite is probably one of the more unique things in this game in that it's sort of like the pipe bomb from Duke 3D or a remote detonator from GoldenEye 64, where you just throw and then hit the trigger. Overall, the gameplay is just fine for what it is. Despite being another war shooter, it has a good amount of variety, at least it isn't entirely boots on the ground. I dare say I even got into the action at times, and even when you're just surveying and trying to sneak around without the guards noticing you. The latter isn't quite so easy. I found myself the majority of the time inevitably devolving into high-octane gunfights. Haters gonna hate. My favorite moments were when you were in the tank in The Last Tiger, sneaking around the snow throwing knives at guards and trying to be stealthily, but overall it's a very serviceable first-person shooter. While I'm more of a retro shooter kind of guy, as I alluded to earlier, I can kind of see why people would enjoy games like this.
Do you like the seaside?
This is most likely where I'm going to be putting the majority of my attention if I'm going to be honest, since I almost exclusively played the single-player campaign. It's split into 5 war stories based on World War II. You've got basically an introduction sequence that zips you around perspectives, which was a pretty cool way to open it up. Then you've got Under No Flag, Nordley's, Try Relure, and The Last Tiger. I'll summarize them in order from my least favorite to my most favorite. There are spoilers ahead, consider this your one and only warning. First off, you've got Try Relure, essentially a campaign about an African division of French soldiers. After being given menial labor, they're given a real break by a French captain to destroy AA emplacements and to capture a chateau. Now, there's nothing wrong with the campaign per se. It's a nice little story about 2 brothers in a squad trying to make something of themselves, but it was the least memorable to me in my opinion. That's just my perspective, and it was pretty interesting how the little brother is very much a tryhard where the older brother just wants to keep everyone alive, but the others just appealed to me more. I might also be a little biased because it seems like the game was being extra unstable in this one. Coming in next is probably the most controversial of the bunch, Nordley's. It tells a tale about two Norwegian female resistance fighters plotting to stop the Germans from producing heavy water to prevent them from potentially creating nukes. Now, just gonna throw this out there, I actually really enjoyed the core concept of sneaking through the snow to disrupt operations. It kinda reminded me of the first mission in 007 Nightfire, since it emphasizes stealth more here and even gives you a silenced pistol reminiscent of the silenced PPK by 007. There's just one eensy-beensy little problem here, and that's that it's based on a real event that involved an entire group of men. Just to prove I'm not being biased here, it was also bad that the new Call of Duty Modern Warfare changed the Highway of Death to be a Russian operation. That's another fine example of historical revision being a very bad thing. Another problem here is that there's a cabin scene that I feel completely disrupts any suspension of disbelief. The main character storms into a cabin, throws a bottle against a German guard's head, slams him against a table, then strangles him out with his own gun. If she was healthy and in fit shape, that wouldn't seem so bad. After all, it's within the parameters of believability in and of itself, even if it's stretching a bit. The problem is, she just fell into an ice-cold lake and was struggling to stay conscious in a frigid blizzard, having to trek quite some distance to get into the cabin. She should be suffering immensely from hypothermia and 1 foot in the grave by this point. Having enough strength to overpower a healthy male German soldier seems flat-out comic book hero levels of absurd. Had they made the story completely fictional and replaced the cabin scene with one of her throwing a knife at the guard's neck while he reaches for his gun or something else that's remotely believable, I would have been perfectly fine with it. It's a nice little story, and believe it or not, I'm okay with the premise of two females infiltrating enemy lines to disrupt an operation. The problem here is that they took a real story with real men who risked their lives and replaced them, essentially trying to rewrite them and silence their story for the sake of pushing an agenda. That's why it's so low on the list. If it wasn't for that and the unbelievable cabin scene, it probably would have been my second favorite, but it still has enough enjoyable elements that it's not least among them. Next up is Under No Flag. It stars Billy friggin' Bridger, a bank robber who's been given a second chance in a special British unit. It may be your typical redemption story, but this is the kind of story that will never get old if you ask me. I also kind of see myself in Billy, because he screws up several times, but it's his determination to keep trying that impresses his superior, George Mason, is the reason he was recruited in the first place. I didn't quite get through it. I didn't quite get through most of them, but I saw the last bits of it on YouTube and I really enjoy how it went down. They're tasked with blowing up airplanes. His bomb fails to go off, so he has to gun down the planes with George being shot in the process. The next part sees George recovering from his injuries while Billy has to take down some radars at supply areas and then find medical supplies for George. He also radios for help to get them out of there. This turns out to be their detriment as it alerts every German in the area where to find them. After a pep talk from George, they have a last stand in a sort of rubble town until reinforcements actually come and they're saved. Yes, it's very cliché, and it's also one of my more favorite stories because it's a very good, nice tale of redemption. Billy screwed up, he wants to set it right, he doesn't always succeed, but he's a trier. You ask me, that's far more motivational than a protagonist that never screws up and magically does everything perfectly. From Star Wars. And of course I saved the best for last, the one I was determined to finish on my own. That would be The Last Tiger. This one actually takes place near the end of the war, where you play as a small team of German soldiers in a tank, defending Cologne, Germany from the Allies as they progress ever further. I love the tone shift throughout it. At first everything's all sunshine and roses and it's all about the strength of Germany. As it goes on, of course, that facade crumbles away really quickly. A young guy with them who's clearly unfit for war, Hartman, disappears in smoke as he's going out to survey the area. What happened to him is a complete mystery until later on when it shows civilians struggling in the rubble and higher-ups executing deserters. Hartman happens to be one of them. They see his body hanging from a signpost labeled as a deserter. Schrader tries to justify it because, of course, he's a good little soldier whose faith in the system cannot be broken no matter what. Peter, however, begins to question what it is he's even fighting for. It really comes to a head when they actually reach the cathedral and realize there's nobody else there to even aid them. They're completely alone and given orders to buy time for the main attack force on the other side of the Rhine. It becomes painfully clear that the odds are against you as you have to fight a few waves of allied tanks, although it's not overly difficult, but then again I was playing on medium. After a short amount of time, you fall back to the bridge to rejoin the other forces, but the Germans destroy the bridge. Kurtz then comes to the sad realization that they lied and left them to die in order to try to save themselves. Kurtz isn't able to find the will to move on, so the brainwashed Schrader shoots him down. Peter loses it and rushes to his side as US allies come swarming in. As the allies plead with him to just give up, Peter places his iron cross on the ground and motions to surrender as Schrader aims his gun at him, and as the screen blacks out you hear gunfire. That is a seriously grim way to end a story campaign. The reason this is my favorite is simply because it's very unique. Not only does it have you playing for the German side, it's at the end of the war. They could have so easily screwed this up or made people think they were sympathizing with patsies, but they actually succeed at making them seem sympathetic while making it clear that their ideology is screwed up. With the exception of Shrouder, you can even see them question the way they do things, and even question if their own leaders didn't simply leave them there to die. It really makes you think about how these German soldiers must have felt near the end of the war. Believe it or not, most of them most likely weren't heavy believers in patriotism. They were simply men fighting for their own country and likely thinking of their families. It's especially unfortunate that many of them were likely influenced to think the way Shrouder did, that you're not allowed to ever surrender even if the odds are overwhelmingly against you. You're just supposed to keep fighting and dying, either by the Allies or by your own men. Overall, the writing is very much a mixed bag. Nordlies was sadly a great blemish with otherwise very good elements in it, and Tyra Lure and Under No Flag were okay, but The Last Tiger is definitely the highlight of the bunch. I think the expectation by now is that you're going to play as the Allies during the war, but you just don't expect them to get such a gut punch by seeing things from the side of the Germans as the war was coming to a close. It's not a perspective people often think about, which makes it quite good. So take that for what you will. It's got some good and it's got some bad. It's merely okay. I definitely don't regret playing through the weekend for free, but in my opinion, I'm not sure they're actually worth paying full price for. As you probably expect, the presentation is the real highlight of the game. Frostbite is definitely a beautiful engine, even on my less than cutting-edge GTX 1050 Ti. The environments are more varied than you may expect. You've got deserts with heat refractions and some contrast to foliage and water, beautiful snow environments with visible footprints and surprisingly realistic terrain, an autumn area with some really beautiful forests and a town, and of course the war-torn Cologne, Germany. I've also played a bit of Pacific Assault, and I must admit the very green and oceanic environments looked really nice for what little I played of it. Naturally, things like shaders and lighting effects are as stellar as you can expect from a modern AAA game, and it's very pleasing to look at. Perhaps the one not-so-pleasing spot was at the beginning of Under No Flag when you're storming through mud, but it's probably not supposed to look pleasing, and it quickly gains some contrast as you go through it. While I wasn't the best at controlling the plane, I'll admit the view you get when riding in one is very breathtaking, even in an area consisting mostly of desert. Kinda makes me wish I had some more time to appreciate it. Perhaps my biggest complaint though is that the high dynamic light can be a bit aggressive, making some areas ridiculously bright as your character's eyes are adjusting. I won't lie, I kinda wish I had an RTX just so I could appreciate the ray tracing effects I've seen in other people's footage of the game. As it is, my GPU won't even allow me to pump the game up to full settings on its own terms, but at least it was good enough that I was able to get a full appreciation for the game. The voice acting is also just fine, and it really moved me in the aforementioned The Last Tiger. The music isn't as memorable simply because it really sounds like your standard war music, but it was fine and it didn't really distract, so I suppose it's certainly acceptable. That's not really a dig at the music, just that I wasn't really paying attention to it, so I can't exactly be too glowing in my appraisal of it. Oddly though, the cinematics would often have glitching problems or even go completely out of sync with the audio. They may not seem like anything too serious, but this is essentially just a game playing a video file. A very high quality video file, yes, but this isn't anything games haven't been doing for decades, so I don't know what the hell was going on there. I guess maybe the game loading behind it strained it or something. Overall, the presentation, as expected, is very top-notch. If there's one thing the AAA game industry has gotten fairly good at, it's making a game look and sound very appealing, and this is no exception. Way to go, DICE. When the game's not suffering from problems, it's eye and ear candy. I'm not gonna lie, the game proved to be more fun than I had anticipated when I first went into it. As someone who sticks mainly to older first-person shooters, especially Doom, I didn't think I'd end up enjoying it quite as much as I did. Now, I'm not itching to go out and buy it, I'm not exactly made of money, but the free weekend ended up being a pretty delightful little binge. Unlike Fallout 76, I could actually see myself coming back to this one if the trial ended up being free to keep forever. Like I said, this isn't a review of the multiplayer, but the war stories have some pretty nice writing at times. The Last Tiger is certainly a unique experience that I haven't really seen in other World War II shooters, so A+ for that. Unless you're into Battlefield's multiplayer though, there might not be enough here to justify purchase, unless you can find it on the cheap.